Well, more now in this war against Ben Bernanke and QE2. We're joined on the phone from Singapore by Jim Rogers, the chairman of Rogers Holdings, and also joining us from Louisville, Kentucky is Bloomberg contributing editor Bethany McLean, who just wrote a piece for Slate magazine on the Fed haters and also the Fed supporters. So good morning to both of you. Jim, I want to start off with you because for years on my program, you've been saying that Ben Bernanke is courting disaster, that he doesn't know anything about economics. Now you've got a chorus of other people joining you as well. And now you're saying that Bernanke is creating distortions in the markets. Tell me exactly how he's doing that.
Well, I'm delighted you remember, Betty, and I've been proven right. The man doesn't know anything about economics. He doesn't know anything about currencies. He doesn't know anything about, the interest rates or what makes the world go round. All he knows is about printing money. And he makes mistake after mistake after mistake. I defy you to find a single time in the last 6 years that he's been in Washington where he's been right about anything, or maybe it's 8 years.
Well, but I don't know if he's been proven wrong yet. It's just that there's been more critics now out there doubting his economic policy.
Well, Betty, have you looked at the price of gold or the price of sugar or the price of cotton or the price of tin or the price of lots of things? How can you say that? The U.S. dollar is under duress. Commodities are going through the roof.
But that's not a bad, okay, I understand that. And actually, that's a good thing for your commodities call, by the way. But that's not necessarily a bad thing for the U.S. economy.
Well, if you're in favor of inflation and a collapse of the U.S., then of course. Most people like to live in a country with a sound currency and where there's stable prices. And we don't have a housing collapse. I happen to prefer, sound currency, sound economy, and sound housing.
Right, but is there something else, though, Jim, to what you've said about Bernanke? Does he also cause complications in your own investment calls? For instance, by him launching QE2, doesn't that make it more difficult for you in terms of your bullish call on China?
No, you're kidding. Look what's happening to commodities. My portfolio essentially is commodities and currencies. Man, it's almost as though I were telling the man what to do. I think he's a disaster. I think he's doing the wrong things. But my goodness, he's certainly making my portfolio look like I know what I'm doing.
So you're making money?
Yes, Betty. I suggest you look at the price of RJA or some of the other things that are out there in the marketplace.
Okay. All right. Let me bring in Bethany on this because, Bethany, you've been writing about people who have been Fed haters or Fed supporters, and I would put Jim Rogers, of course, as a longtime Fed hater. What are they usually after?
Well, I think my piece for Slate is about how there are three distinct categories of Fed critics. And the first group are the people who are critical of QE2. The second group are people who have been critical of the Fed's policies for a long time. And to Jim's point, part of the criticism is that the Fed repeatedly blows bubbles in asset classes and then disavows any responsibility for spotting or stopping the bubble before it wreaks havoc on the economy.
Right.
And then the third category in which I think Jim belongs, although he can feel free to disagree with me, is people who are fundamentally opposed to the Fed on principle and believe would be better off with a return to the gold standard and believe that the old days when a bank run was a possible thing wasn't such a bad idea because that imposed some discipline on bankers. And so you really have to think about the ideology of where people are coming from when they criticize the Fed and whether it's a short-term criticism of QE2 or a much longer, deeper criticism.
Well, Jim, where do you land on this? Do you agree? Do you fundamentally disagree with the Fed?
Well, I disagree with the Fed on QE2. I certainly agree that they've...
Oh, no, let me rephrase that. Fundamentally disagree with even the existence of the Fed.
Well, the world's better off without central banks. As you know, the U.S. has had central banks in our history. The first two disappeared. This one's going to disappear, too. Sure, we have problems with when we don't have central. But unfortunately, central banks make it worse, as we're finding out in the last 20 years under Greenspan and Bernanke. They've taken on staggering amounts of debt. They've created bubble after bubble after bubble. These guys go from one mistake to another. Fortunately, they don't have to listen. They're going to bankrupt themselves with their own mistakes.
Right, and Bethany, these are people that are not outliers anymore, right? Jim's, I wouldn't call Jim an outlier quite that way anymore.
Well, I'm not sure there always was a really interesting sort of economic/philosophical rationale behind the argument. I think most of the popular press tends to think of Fed haters as, Tea Party members, something insanely crazy. How can you possibly think about this institution of the Fed as anything other than sort of motherhood and apple pie?
Right.
But actually, the criticism is quite fundamental and quite interesting if you look at some of the things people have written, whether it's Jim Grant writing Bring Back the Bank Run back in 1990, or the sort of intellectual father of this movement talking about how there was going to have to be a taxpayer bailout if the system continued as it was, and that was in 1994.
Wow.
And
okay.
so the words sound pretty prescient today.
They do indeed. Okay. All right, Bethany, hang on because we're going to be back with you in a little bit. And I want to thank Jim Rogers for joining us from Singapore to talk about his thoughts on the Fed. And Jim, I know I'll see you on Skype sometime soon.